I think we should begin and people will keep joining us. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the second lecture of the 2023 Spring Series at the Israeli Forum of Early Medieval Studies. I am delighted to welcome our speaker of the day, Professor Deborah Deliyannis from Indiana University, Bloomington. Professor Deliyannis specializes in medieval historiography, urban change in late antiquity, and material culture and archaeology. As of 2022, Professor Deliyannis is a fellow at the Medieval Academy of America. And since 2003, she has been a member of the editorial board of Brill's series in the early Middle Ages. Also, since 2012, Professor Deliyannis has been a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the St. Martin of Tours European Cultural Center. Professor Deliyannis received the Robert L. Kendrick Carra Award for Outstanding Service to Medieval Studies in 2020 and the Individual Research Award from the Institute for Advanced Study at Indiana University in 2016. Among her many publications, I will mention 50 Early Medieval Things, Materials of Culture in Late Antiquity and the Early Middle Ages with Paolo Squatriti and Henrik Day, published with Cornell University Press in 2019, Ravenna in Late Antiquity, published with Cambridge University Press in 2010, and her edition of Angelus of Ravenna, Liber Pontificalis Ecclesiae Ravennatis, in the Corpus Christianorum Continuatio Medievalis series issued with Prepos publishers in 2006. Lastly, her current project and upcoming book is Bishops and Church Building in the Early Middle Ages. Today, Professor Deliyannis will talk about early medieval churches, real and imagined. As usual, we will have time for questions after the talk. Feel free to message me or raise your hand and I'll ask you to present your question. With that being said, Professor Deliyannis, thank you for agreeing to be with us. And the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. And I first would like to thank Mor and Shachar for the honor of an invitation to speak to you today. I was asked whether I could speak on something to do with material culture. And so I have decided to talk about the interest that has guided my career from the beginning, namely the relationship between material culture and the texts that describe it, and specifically church buildings. All of this started when I was an archaeology major as an undergraduate. In 1986, I was taking Charles McClendon's seminar on Anglo-Saxon art and architecture. And I still remember the moment when I saw this image in Eric Fernie's book, The Architecture of the Anglo-Saxons. I was transfixed. What the heck was that? It was completely bizarre and fascinating. And I spent the next 2 years of my undergraduate career trying to understand it. It is, of course, an archaeological ground plan of the old Minster Cathedral at Winchester in England. And I learned that while the archaeology can tell us about the size of the building and its phases, and perhaps something about the superstructure, we cannot understand the appearance and, more important, the meaning of the architecture or the importance of the building to its builders and viewers without reading contemporary texts. In the case of the Old Minster, these ranged from the vitae of Bishop St. Swithin, whose tomb is here on the plan, and Bishop Ethelwald, to a monastic reform document, the Regularis Concordia, which describes Easter services in such a building. However, I've spent much of the past 30 years studying the history and monuments of the city of Ravenna in Italy. Ravenna is unusual in that it contains several late antique or early medieval churches that do still survive, at least in part, and it also has a history of its bishops, written in the 830s by a priest of Ravenna named Angelus, who describes the construction of these and other non-surviving churches, both built by the bishops and by the city's secular rulers. I am, of course, endlessly fascinated by the standing buildings and mosaics of Ravenna. In fact, this is an advertisement. I think I have just found some evidence of Arian theology in the mosaics of the Arian baptistry, finally, after 30 years of looking for them. But that's a different talk. My main interest has always been the way that buildings are experienced, both at the time they were built and later. And while art historians and archaeologists base some of their conclusions on data analysis and anthropological parallels, texts are just as important to understand the way that the physical environment was understood and used. As an example from the book 50 Early Medieval Things that I wrote with Paolo Squattriti and Hendrik Day, one can understand a comb made out of bone to be an implement that can be locally and cheaply produced and used to groom hair, but it's texts that help us understand the importance of hair, both to men and to women, in Lombard Italy, and thus we can better understand why this particular comb was found in the grave of a man. And in order to use texts, you have to understand how and why they are written and why material culture is mentioned and described in them at all. So today I want to talk about some of the results of my current research project about how churches are described in early medieval written sources and what the language means. Since many of these buildings no longer survive, these constitute in some way imagined churches, or maybe better put, an imaginary of churches. And then I want to think about how understanding the thought world that surrounded churches, and particularly church patronage, can help us to imagine how actual or real church buildings were meant to be understood. I'm going to argue that rather than, or perhaps in addition to, thinking in terms of iconography in a Krautheimerian sense, or imitation of other buildings, we should focus on visual impact as symbolic of moral effect, that the appearance of a church was intended to unite Christians with other Christians, with biblical people in general, and with God's wishes for human places of his worship, specifically when he instructed Solomon on how to build the temple in Jerusalem. And I should say at this point that this little image here that I used on my first slide, I'm not going to talk about. But my training as an art historian compels me to point it out, because I was taught you always have to talk about what the images that you show. It's one of the rare depictions of Solomon's temple on anything from the early Middle Ages that I could find. And it's relatively late, but there it is. All right, imagine churches. Whoops. We do not, for the most part, have texts that were written to be descriptions or explanations of art and architecture from our academic point of view. Most descriptions come from texts that are doing something else: praising a patron, writing biography of secular or ecclesiastical or saintly people, describing the environment of a saint's cult, providing a guidebook for pilgrims, etc. Of these, the largest group of texts that contain descriptions of buildings are the various types of texts that praise the patron of a church. These range from in situ inscriptions to letters to biographies to works of serial biography of bishops. These formats are genres that have their roots in the cultures of the ancient Mediterranean and played a role in Jewish and Greco-Roman culture and literature that shaped Christian ideas. Thus, in order to understand what a description of a building means, we have to understand the context of the text in which it's found. This tells us why certain words are used, why the description is included at all, what the author wanted us to think, and perhaps, just perhaps, how the author felt when actually in a building. Descriptions of buildings, in other words, might be real or might be imaginary. Real if they correspond to what was actually there, something that we can only know if we have both the text and the surviving building. Imaginary if the meaning of imaginary corresponds to what we might imagine about the building. Imaginary buildings play a role in texts that refer to other texts, and that's what I'm going to describe. The prototype of all of this is the Temple of Solomon, which was presumably once a real building, but whose description, did it correspond to reality, became a part of the Bible and then served as a model for actual buildings, as a topic of exegesis, and as an example of how God wanted man to worship him. The very inclusion of the description of the temple in the Bible led Christians and Jews, or Jews and Christians, to grapple with the question of how a real building can be allegorized and interpreted. And as a result, theologians produced a complex interplay of how real buildings were designed, how they were described, and what both the building and the description mean. What we know about Solomon's temple comes from the Old Testament books of Samuel and Kings, written between 586 and 516 BC, and Chronicles, written in the 4th century BC, thus both all after the destruction of the temple. According to these books, King David wanted to replace the tabernacle with a permanent temple and began planning it, but execution and completion were left to his successor Solomon, who was king from around 970 to 931 BC. Solomon's construction of the temple and palace in Jerusalem is described in extended passages which recount all sorts of details, including the layout and measurements of the structure, which I have put, that's this one here, all the different dimensions. I'm sorry, this passage is only in Latin. Mostly I'll have English as well. And in particular, the details, including weights and measures of gold, cedar wood, and other very precious materials that were lavishly used throughout the building. The descriptions of these structures, moreover, are filled with superlative adjectives, indicating that the excellence of the materials was appropriate for the veneration of God, and moreover, that God himself wanted these materials to be used. And so we'll see these again. These are vessels, vases, gold and silver, precious stones, and so on. According to the Bible, Solomon's temple, after standing for over 350 years, was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. In 539 BC, the Persians conquered the Babylonians, and their ruler Cyrus allowed the Jews of Babylonia to return to Jerusalem and establish a Jewish-led province of the Persian Empire. A second temple was completed around 518 BC, which survived with a major rebuilding under Herod in 38 to 4 BC, until it was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. What we know about the Second Temple comes partly from the books of Ezra, First Esdras, and Maccabees, but largely from the description of Herod's temple given by Josephus in his Antiquities shortly after its destruction. The importance of the temples of Jerusalem in Jewish thought and exegesis are embarrassingly not part of my area of expertise. Based on the one wall painting that we know about from the 3rd century synagogue at Duri-Ropus in Syria, one of the panels of which you see here, the temples were clearly central to Jewish concepts of religious life. However, what I do know about, the Jerusalem temples are everywhere in Christian literature and thought. For Christians, the Jerusalem temple was initially a problem. Jesus, who was very familiar with the Second Temple, made it clear that he did not think much of temple worship. In Matthew 6, Jesus says, among other things, don't stand and pray in public, go into your inner room, close your door, and pray to your Father in secret. And then in one of the most prophetic passages in the Gospels, Luke 21, 5, 6, recounts when some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts. He said, as for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another, all will be thrown down. And then in the epistles, the apostles make various references to the fact that the temple is actually the believer. It's in 1 Peter, the living stones and the spiritual house, and more explicitly in 1 Corinthians, do you not know that you are the temple of God and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person. For God's temple is holy and you are that person. Based on these passages, some Christian theologians, following an argument expressed most forcefully by Jerome, explicitly criticized the use of an Old Testament model for Christian living and argued as a result that Christians should not have splendid churches. There are many examples in Jerome's letters. Here is one of the most notable in which Jerome explicitly rejects the Jewish temple. He starts by saying many build churches nowadays, their walls and pillars of glowing marble, their ceilings glittering with gold, their altars studded with jewels. But then he explains that Christianity has rejected the Old Testament, then rejecting the superstition of the Jews, we must also reject the gold. In many other passages, which I will pass over quickly, but I'm going to come back to these, Jerome strongly states that even though some people are building splendid churches, the duty of a Christian is to use money instead to feed the poor. And as I said, I'll come back to some of these. Other Christian theologians, such as Ambrose, put forth an interesting fusion of the Ciceronian idea that all buildings perish. He may get it from Lactantius, who does the same thing. For there is nothing, as the orator Cicero says, made by labor which old age does not weaken and consume. And Ambrose combines that with the Temple of Solomon, the temple which Solomon built, which was overthrown by the enemy. For there is nothing made by manual labor that is not diminished by age. We see it again. I just put this one up too in Prudentius and in lots of other examples from around the late fourth and early 5th centuries. And we'll see this again too. Some bishops who were not quite so vehement, such as Zeno of Verona, wrote sermons for the occasion of the dedication of a church, in which they praised the church building, but note that the true ecclesia was the congregation. And so here is Zeno, who starts out by saying the Temple of Solomon was splendid, and I'm going to come back to that too. And then he says, our church is not as good as that. But then he says that's okay, because the gospel writers teach us to reject the temple anyway, because it's not the true temple. And there are other examples like this. Exegetes from Augustine to Bede explain that the biblical temples must be understood allegorically and not literally. And yet, Christians were fascinated by the extended description of Solomon's temple in the Bible. Eusebius's chronicle, this is the ecclesiastical history, Eusebius's chronicle includes extensive information about the Temple of Solomon, and even Jerome likewise used the temple's construction as a historical milestone in his translation and continuation of the chronicle. And we'll see that again too. Literally, as soon as Constantine launched the trend of building large, splendid churches, writers such as Eusebius, his biographer, explicitly compared church builders to Solomon. Notably, Eusebius included a very lengthy sermon that he delivered on the dedication of a basilica built by Bishop Paulinus of Tyre, in which Paulinus, as you can see up here, is called a new Bezaleel, the architect of the divine tabernacle, a new Solomon, and a new Zerubbabel. And he praises Paulinus for the splendor of his buildings, saying they are worthy of wonder and admiration, clear signs of the sovereignty of our Savior. That's this part here. However, Eusebius also expounded at length in his sermon on the idea that the true temple is the congregation, and that the building that has just been built has to be understood allegorically. And this is a small part of that. In subsequent centuries, it turns out that if you look for Solomon's temple, you find it everywhere. Dedication inscriptions from Constantinople to Africa to Britain praise the patrons of churches as Solomonic. Here is one from 5th century Gaul, Sidonius Apollinaris, the church which is such to rival the Temple of Solomon, and down here in the dedication poem. Here is a part of the dedication poem to Saint Polyeuctus in Constantinople, which states that the founder surpassed the wisdom of the celebrated Solomon, raising a temple to receive God. We should also remember that Justinian, at least by the 9th century, if not earlier, is said to have said, Solomon, I have surpassed you when entering Hagia Sophia. Biographers praise their subjects as pious leaders like Solomon. Notably, in such texts, the language used to describe church building borrows from the biblical descriptions of the temple. Here are some passages of patronage from the Roman Liber Pontificalis, or History of the Popes, being we've got all of the vessels, the Argenteum Purissimum, the Omnia Vasa, and so on. The Liber Pontificalis was one of the earlier and certainly one of the most influential examples of this type of text. Thus, the two different ways of understanding Solomon's temple impact the ways that authors describe their own churches and the meaning they hope to impart in their texts. While many authors offer only praise for splendid buildings, some authors speak from both sides, praising great builders on the one hand, but offering moral lessons on the other, sometimes in the same text and sometimes in works of different genres. I'd like to offer a couple of examples from the 6th to the 8th, from 6th to 8th century Francia. Gregory of Tours' 10 books of histories begin with the creation of the world, and large parts are based on the Eusebius Jerome Chronicle, in which, as I've said, the temple's construction was used as a historical milestone. Jerome, for the year Annus Abrahami 984, says Solomon began to build the temple in Jerusalem and completed the work in 7 years. Gregory of Tours says in his histories, this Solomon built the temple in the name of the Lord of marvelous workmanship, bringing in so much gold and silver, bronze and iron, that it is said by some that no similar building in the world has ever been made. Numquam simile mundo. And I underscore that because that is a concept I'm going to come back to several times. In opposition to Jerome, Gregory emphasizes that Jerome is not emphasizing the splendor, just that he built it. Gregory emphasizes the splendors of its material and workmanship, stating that it was the most splendid building ever. In his histories, Gregory of Tours uses the topos of church building when describing particularly notable bishops and kings. Some of the buildings are described at great length. Church patronage is one of the virtues a good king or bishop might possess, which is a topic that topos that derives from the Book of Kings and the Liber Pontificalis and inscription tradition. Indeed, Gregory is the first known author to have written a work of episcopal succession modeled on the Roman Liber Pontificalis, which comes at the end of the histories. That's the first example up here. And his notable builders include Bishop Perpetuus, about whom he says, he having pulled down or removed the basilica which Bishop Rictius had early built over St. Martin, built another larger one, Muro of marvelous workmanship, into whose apse he translated the blessed body of that venerable saint. And Gregory goes on to list many other church foundations in this section about the bishops of Tours. Earlier in Book 2 of the Histories, Gregory had described 2 churches in this way, enumerating the dimensions, the parts of the building, and the decoration. I have put up Nematius of Clermont's church, the description of his church, in which he describes the dimensions in feet, an apse, aisles, the form of a cross, 42 windows, 70 columns, and 8 doors, and variegated work near the altar walls. This is very reminiscent to the biblical description of the Temple of Solomon, including the dimensions and the numbers, etc. Less well known is Gregory's astronomical treatise, De Cursu Stellarum Ratio, in which he describes the heavenly bodies, and then he lists each month and tells which constellations, stars, and planets can be seen at what hour, and how many psalms can be sung between these appearances. And the whole thing is designed so that you can go up and look at the sky and figure out when it's time to sing psalms. This text has primarily been studied by historians of science as evidence of Gregory's attitude toward nature. However, the preface begins thus: many philosophers, when they had leisure for literary studies, wrote of 7 wonders greater than others, of which I have been pleased to set before you and to mention other things, of which these are considered most admirable, either in appearance or workmanship. He then lists the 7 wonders of the world and provides a description, brief or long, about each one. The list is pretty weird. It does not correspond at all to the classical descriptions of the 7 wonders by authors like Vitruvius or even Cassiodorus. Indeed, most accounts of the 7 wonders provide only a list and not descriptions of the wonders. Most notably, Gregory includes Solomon's temple. And here's what he wrote about the 7 wonders. On the left, I don't expect you to read it, on the left are the descriptions of 6 of the wonders, and on the right is his description of Solomon's temple. He writes literally almost as much about Solomon's temple as he does about the other 6 wonders. And what he says about it is, the third is the Temple of Solomon, which was a wonder not so much because of the size of its fabric, but rather because of its decoration. And he then has these 5 paragraphs about the decoration, the wood, the gold, the dimensions. Here it is broken down if you want to see. The orange is the dimensions, the green are the pictures, the blue is the wood, and gold, or the yellow, is the references to gold. It's very biblical. After completing his list of the 7 wonders, Gregory then explains why he has listed them in this work, saying, man-made wonders are doomed to ruin, but the natural wonders of the world created by God will last until the end of the world. And this is, in fact, a very fascinating expansion of the concept derived from Cicero and the other authors, adopted by Christian authors for the temple. Thus, Gregory of Tours was well aware of the variety of Christian attitudes toward the temple and to church splendor. He knew it was futile. He knew it was doomed to ruin, but at the same time, he was happy to give a Solomonic spin to descriptions of churches in his work as well.
Hello. Are you coming?
Compare this description. There are many other examples of this kind of people talking out of both sides about building, and I want to briefly mention the Vita of Desiderius, Bishop of Cahors, in the 7th century. Desiderius was bishop of Cahors from 636 to 655. His Vita was written in the late 8th century, 100 years or more after his death. The hagiographer, therefore, relied on written sources and what he could see in the city. Desiderius's Vita is full of extravagant descriptions of the churches that Desiderius built or decorated. I put up these long quotes, partly not to have you try and read them all before I move on, but to show you how long these descriptions actually are. Over and over, these descriptions praise the size, splendor, and beauty of the buildings and their furnishings in both general terms and by describing the specific building elements. So this one here, the size of the sublime houses, the marvelous height of the basilicas, the surrounding beauty of the vaults, of notable and singular fabric. Here's another one. This one is about his donated chalices. There was so much splendor in the chalices, gems, glittering, sparkling, crowns, candelabra, and so on. It's very Solomonic. And the language is, in my opinion, Solomonically inflected. He talks about marvelous size. He talks about sublime height and splendor. However, the anonymous author was also very influenced by the writings of Jerome, and specifically quotes several of Jerome's very letters that criticize excessive money spent on church building. So, for example, this passage seems to be a straightforward account of Desiderius keeping a church clean. He was always attentive to the exterior needs for the temple. He took pains that the gleaming altar be ready, that the walls be free of soot, that the pavements be without, and so on, right? Sounds very nice. This passage is almost a direct quote from Jerome's letter to Heliodorus in consolation for the death of Nepotian, whom he says took pains to keep the altar bright, the church walls free from soot, etc. And this is Jerome's only letter where he even suggests that a beautiful church might be a good thing. But there's more. After listing all some of Desiderius's churches in chapter 2, the anonymous author says that while he had notable zeal for exterior construction, he had equal zeal to build the summits of souls, saying indeed that it was good to build a house for Christ, to clad it with marble, to make it splendid with paint, to overshadow it with gold and gems, to decorate paneled ceilings, to lay pavements, but it was much better to prepare souls to be worthy of heavenly marriage, since a soul should be believed to be the true temple of Christ. And that is not quite a direct quote, but definitely taken from Jerome's letters to Demetrius and Nepotianus, both of which speak of columns, gold ornaments, pillars, glowing marble, and so on, and both of which have the structure. Some people build nice, splendid churches, but really it's the tending to the poor and the soul is better. And I mean, I can go on. I don't want to belabor this. This passage here, where he says this passage at the end, the soul should be believed to be the true temple of Christ. That is also a quote from Jerome's letter to the noted builder, Paulinus of Nola, in which Jerome says, what use are walls blazing with jewels when Christ in his poor is danger of perishing from hunger? So the author of this Vita is bringing in all of this Jeromean criticism into a work in which he praises building. And I was flabbergasted when I figured all of this out. So what is all the description of splendid churches then? Is the description of splendid churches just to allow the author to make a Jeromean or a Jerome-like point about the futility of Desiderius's buildings? I don't think that cannot be it. And was the person who entered an early medieval church, which was splendid, supposed to view the splendor and think about the true temple? I don't think so. Dominic Janes has traced the language of splendor in late antique texts of all sorts. He notes that mosaics in churches were an element of what he calls a parade of riches, used because the aesthetics and values of the Roman Empire closely linked virtue and power with treasure. I would add to that the fact that Christians could also point to the Old Testament and say that God wanted treasure in his temple made this synthesis easier. And of course, once you accept the treasure aesthetic, building something splendid makes the patron famous for both secular and religious buildings. Even Solomon, who supposedly built the temple to honor God, in his own dedication speech to the temple, praises God and praises himself. In this mindset, the more splendor, the more piety. Imitation of Solomon extends also to the holding of dedication festivals on the model of Solomon's, and we see that in numerous texts, letters and poems by Avitus of Vienne and Sidonius Apollinaris and Desiderius himself, various other texts, and we'll see another one. So if you're going to praise the first Christian Roman Emperor Constantine, or a bishop in Merovingian France, or a king, you praise the splendor. It's what you do, not just because Roman emperors did it, but because Solomon also did it. The key point of focus is splendor, for praise or blame. Solomon's temple is super splendid at God's command, and therefore Christians should also do the same kind of thing. It's interesting to note which features are considered marvelous in these different types of texts. So Zeno of Verona says that the Temple of Solomon was notable for its size, workmanship, decoration, or material, all together united in one splendor. This, I forgot to label it, this is Gregory of Tours again, who said that the Temple of Solomon was a wonder not so much because of the size, but because of its decoration. To be a Solomon, then, you are not just a pious leader who provides infrastructure, you are providing splendid infrastructure in a marvelous way, even potentially in an exceptional way. But how did this literary landscape compare to reality? Was this rhetoric shaped by the reality of churches? Was the reality shaped by the rhetoric of Solomonic splendor? Or was the reality in an objective comparative sense distinct from the rhetoric? We need to know this because for the early Middle Ages, it is rare that we have both a building and a text that describes it. And this brings me, of course, to Angelus of Ravenna. I can't give a talk anywhere without talking about Angelus. Angelus's 9th century Book of Pontiffs of the Church of Ravenna is fascinating for a whole host of reasons, but for architectural and art historians, its importance is not simply that Angelus describes churches, but rather that his are some of the few descriptions for which the churches still survive. So, for example, Angelus tells us of the Church of San Vitale that no church in Italy is similar in structures and mechanical works, and this is completely in the line of the topos of this is the greatest building ever, right? Simulus nulla, simulus est. And if you ignore San Lorenzo in Milan and San Stefano Rotondo in Rome and a few more, Angelus had a point. And not to mention that at the time Angelus was writing, Charlemagne had just imitated San Vitale, specifically at Aachen. Angelus both describes buildings himself, and he transcribes many dedicatory inscriptions from Ravenna's churches. So indeed, we can see that a poem that describes the glittering, glowing effects of the Archiepiscopal Chapel does indeed refer to a truly spectacular glittering space. Here's the Archiepiscopal Chapel. Here is the inscription set up in it by its founder, which speaks about the marble, the light, very famously, the enclosed radiance, the marble flourishing with bright rays, and the stones. It's the This tells us that the patrons were well aware of the effect they wanted to produce. They were able to express why they wanted it, and we can look at it, and Angelus could look at it and see what they were trying to do. Likewise, in the Orthodox baptistry, Angelus records the inscription here, yield, old name, yield age to newness, behold, the glory of the renewed font shines more beautifully. And Angelus also says, Neon decorated the baptistries of the Ursiana church most beautifully. He set up in mosaic and gold tesserae the images of the apostles and their names in the vault. And all of this, we can also see that still survives. So, it is not a stretch to believe Angelus literally when he describes paintings of biblical scenes in the Episcopal dining hall or in the now lost Church of the Virgin Mary or various other churches that don't survive. And he tells us of the pictures and the inscriptions in them. So using Angelus to tell us what was once there seems to be a valid methodology. But what else can we do with his descriptions in light of what I've said about the temple and its varied meanings? I will say, first of all, there is no hint of ambiguity in Angelus about his Solomonic language. He never tries to explain away the splendor of the buildings he describes. And in this, he is imitating his model, the Roman Liber Pontificalis, which likewise lists and enumerates patronage without trying to explain it as a symbol of something else. I interpret this as an imitation by all of these texts of the books of Kings. However, Angelus does do a bit more than the Roman Liber Pontificalis' lists. Sometimes he provides a sermon that can help to interpret an image, such as for the example of the three magi in Sant'Apollinare Nuovo. Sometimes he tells of a miracle associated with a picture, which is related, among other things, to iconoclasm, but it also is a way of understanding the pictures. And he includes inscriptions, which the Roman Liber Pontificalis does not. Clearly, Angelus admired the mosaics. He interacted with the mosaics. We might say the inscriptions taught him how to admire the mosaics. They taught us, they teach us how to admire them too. In other words, Angelus reports the splendor of the churches of Ravenna with other meanings. Biblical meanings, exegetical meanings, doctrinal and spiritual meanings, which to some extent reflect the aims of the patrons and some extent the interests of the audience, which is Angelus. And that is what splendor can be used for. So what do we do when we find a similar text of inscription, but all we have is a ground plan and no evidence of superstructure? Or more likely, we have no evidence of a building at all. Can we interpret a text literally? Do we search for iconographic meaning? Or can we try and understand the meaning of the splendor in whatever form it took as the main point of the description? If we go back to Francia, we've seen that Gregory of Tours and the hagiographer of Desiderius were promoting splendor and Solomonic meaning in all its ramifications. Should we understand these descriptions literally? Sidonius Apollinaris wrote this poem praising a church built at Lyon by Bishop Patiens as a building with a gilded ceiling, marble distinct with varied shininess, varicolored designs, verdant grass green incrustation and sapphire stones, columns, and so on. Gregory, as we've already looked at, Gregory describes the church at Clermont as what we call a basilica in our modern use of the term, as a long building with columns and windows and so on. We know from archaeology that such basilicas existed in Gaul, so there is no particular reason to doubt that the one at Clermont was that kind of building. The next one. Venantius Fortunatus, a bit later, describes a glittering effect of marble and glass in other texts. This has been discussed by Michael Roberts. I note here that this poem also begins, if one calls to mind the structure of Solomon's temple, and then says this church is better because Solomon's temple was the old law and this is the new. And this one is founded upon Christianity, but then he goes on to praise the columns, the glass, the light, and so on. There are texts such as those of Gregory of Tours, and I put up here, but also in the Gesta of Bishops of Auxerre and other sources that specifically mention mosaics. Christian Sapin has recently cataloged these and analyzed them. Here is one. He elaborated with columns, he embellished with marble, he illustrated with mosaic. That's at Chalon-sur-Saône. This one at Cologne also was filled with mosaic. Here is one of the ones at Auxerre. And as Sapin has shown, there are enough archaeological finds of glass and gold-backed tesserae and archaeological excavations in Gaul that texts that describe them are likely to reflect the reality. Here we have a fragment of mosaic from the original 5th century of Church of the Virgin in Toulouse, which was known as La Daurade, or the Gilded. Here is a fragment, I love this one, from Marseille, a small piece that still survives. So one way to use textual descriptions of churches is as a guide to what was actually there. In the case of flowery language that we have a harder time understanding what is meant, we are at a loss to know what to do. So in the life of Desiderius, further his industry built next to the mother church 2 houses, each balanced with double arches, windows crosswise, staircases adjoining, separate in position, harmonious in layout, sharing oratories, decorated with columns, and built with square stones of marvelous size and set up in marvelous arrangement. We don't know what that means. On the other hand, there are archaeological remains from churches. This one at Grenoble has always fascinated me, and I've never actually looked closely into it. This is a fantastic ground plan. It's very complicated. It has staircases. It's not hard to imagine something like that had been seen by Desiderius and perhaps was imitated. But I think there's also a danger in trying to read too much into descriptions that may or may not have corresponded to a formal reality. And this is precisely because the authors of such descriptions were operating in a literary environment in which descriptions of splendor defined a great building, or more likely a great patron, regardless of how this was carried out in reality. And I want to finish up by going back to where I began in England. Stephen of Ripon wrote a vita of Bishop Wilfrid of York around 720, in which he chronicles the bishop's construction of churches in York, Hexham, Ripon, and elsewhere. This is a work of hagiography and thus includes statements about Wilfrid's charity and humility. Wilfrid was not a humble guy, but those statements are in there. Stephen also provides details of the elaborate construction activity, for example, at the Church of Ripon. Here in the middle, he built this church with gold and silver and every shade of purple, marvelously decorated it. For in Ripon, he built and completed a basilica, built with polished stone from its foundations in the ground up to the summit, filled with various columns and porticos. And guess what? Like Solomon's temple, it was consecrated on completion to the Lord. As Mark Lane-Smith has shown, the appeal of to the Old Testament and much of the language, the words for gold and silver and purple and precious stones, shows that the author understood the biblical model of patronage. In other words, Stephen uses the Temple of Jerusalem literally and depicts Wilfrid as a new Solomon. Stephen also describes the dedication ceremony for the church at Ripon, attended by kings, abbots, bishops, and dignitaries, at which, in church, Wilfrid read out a list of the estates that had been donated by the kings for their souls. This is clearly an echo of Solomon's dedication feast for the temple, Constantine's donations at Rome, perhaps, the dedication of the church at Tyre. There are a host of examples. Lane-Smith suggests that the references to Solomon are supposed to raise ideas of allegory along the model of beads on the temple in the reader's mind, and that is interesting for a reader of a text. Stephen describes Wilfrid's language, his building, in apparently specific language. The columns, the porticos, the polished stone. Here is his description of the church at Hexham, where he speaks of its crypts of wonderfully dressed stone and the manifold building above ground, supported by various columns again, and many porticos, and adorned with walls of notable length and height, surrounded by various winding passages with spiral stairs leading up and down. And finally, Bede reports the poetic epitaph of Wilfrid in the church of Ripon, which begins, "Here lies the body of Wilfrid," and starts out by talking about the gold and Tyrian purple, the cross of gleaming metal, and the decorations of the church. In this epitaph, aside from anything else, Wilfrid was imitating Roman and Italian examples of poetic and Gallic examples of poetic epitaphs of bishops. All of the accounts of Wilfrid emphasize his donation of precious objects to his churches. And from the evidence we have from the 7th, 8th, and 8th centuries, it's not hard to believe that this must have been extremely luxurious. I realized I could have given a completely different talk today and talked just about the gold objects donated to churches. Note in the center, the Ripon jewel. This was found actually at Ripon. In a bit more decrepit state than the other examples. So there's this, but Stephen does emphasize the beauty of the architecture and especially the columns and the porticos. And one of the interesting things about Wilfrid's churches is that from what we know from archaeology, the buildings in England were very different from those on the continent. So were Hexham and Ripon actually what we today call basilicas? He uses the word basilica, and he talks about columns. Wilfrid had been to the continent several times. He visited Rome in the 650s, in 679, and in 703, and he saw many churches in Rome and along his journey, old and new. However, the church at Ripon has been destroyed many times, and nothing remains of the superstructure. All that remains is the crypt, which is the one on the right, and you see the pictures here, which is indeed built of stone taken from Roman buildings. Hexham's crypt on the left also survives. These are very famous, and the walls are lined with Roman stone. At Hexham, there has been some archaeology of the superstructure. So here's the crypt, and here are bits and pieces of what has actually been found, enough that if you want, you could propose a basilica, which is what's been done in this reconstruction model here, but you also could not. There has been extensive discussion about what the sources of inspiration for Wilfrid's buildings were, partly based on the scanty layout, partly on the description. Were they modeled on Rome? Were they modeled on Francia? I'm not convinced that we have enough information to say really very much about that. Joyce Hill has recently, and I think correctly, picked apart the description of Ripon here and pointed out that porticos does not mean side aisles, but in Anglo-Saxon England in this context, as Bede uses the word anyway, refers to small chambers flanking a nave. Bede uses it specifically for this church at Canterbury. And that she proposes that what Wilfrid built was probably more like this than what we technically would call a basilica. Stephen's account of Hexham describes a more complex building or set of buildings. I don't doubt that they were complicated. I would only point out that he concludes, nor have we heard any house built in this way on this side of the Alps, which is pretty much like Agnello's saying no church in Italy is similar. It's the topos. This is the best church building ever. And the fact is that the churches that we know about from this period in England, early medieval England, are small and are not columnar basilicas. The churches at Bede's Monastery at Jarrow are not. The church at Escombe here is not. Even the original church at Winchester, with which I began, this is the first phase of it. It was big. It was fully equal to continental buildings in its size, but it was not a basilica. They don't exhibit the same kind of architectural complexity as what is known on the continent, which would have been obvious to Wilfrid or anyone else who had been to Rome. There was no suggestion of mosaic. Bede and others frequently mention glass and glassmaking, and glass has been found at Jarrow. These pictures are modern. They found the pieces and they glued they I guess put them together to make these design and pictures, but this is not original. So we know that there was colored glass. And yet a reader of Wilfrid's Vita, who had never been to Ripon or Hexham, might well have the impression that their churches were similar to the great basilicas of the continent. Various columns, after all, was a stock phrase that we have seen many times in the text that I have shown you. This was precisely the point. Wilfrid's churches displayed all the splendor of which he was capable. He and his followers praised him for it, and by doing so, they put their churches into dialogue with a world of Solomon-inspired worship structures modeled on the Jerusalem temple. That ideal of splendor was being imitated throughout the Christian world, both in reality and in the writings that explain the significance of the reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Deliyannis. That was wonderful. And I open the floor for discussion. So if anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand or send your name. I'll open the discussion with a question of my own, if that's okay. So you really portrayed the bias between the sponsor the sponsor giving money or building a church as an act of piety and honoring God, and on the other hand, as something that should be counted not as important, giving Jesus's example. And I was wondering if among all the examples you examined, you see differences based on the historical circumstances. So how does the time of migration, war, how does that affect how people would describe church building? And is it okay to build something splendor, or it should be perhaps not preferred to feeding the poor, for example?
That is an interesting question. I haven't thought about that. It is notable that the descriptions of churches that build on the other descriptions of churches, and obviously they aren't all reading everybody else, but some of them are reading some other people. These descriptions continue straight through the fall of Rome, for example. But maybe they stop building so many big churches, or in some places they stop mining stone, producing tesserae, anything else. The descriptions are the same. That is the puzzle, I think, for archaeology. I mean, that's the whole thing with mosaic, right? The question is, if they talk about mosaic, was there mosaic? We know there is mosaic in the 9th century. Did it continue straight through? What I have found is not so much that, okay, well, there's a short answer to that, which is, economically speaking, there are fewer churches described in Ravenna, for example, after the end of the 6th century than before. And that probably does have to do with political and possibly economic circumstances. Rome as well has a pattern of, more and less depending on what's going on. And of course, a big boom in the Carolingian period. Part of the trouble is disentangling who's writing those texts and when and why from the sources that they get for when churches were built. But it definitely does seem to ebb and flow. The other thing I think I would say is that I notice less, but I would have to think about it more, about the economic circumstances. I notice it more that monastic authors are less likely to praise splendid churches, and Episcopal authors are more likely to. And then the question would be, are there more monastic authors at certain times or more Episcopal authors at other times? Is that tied into economics, or is that tied into something else? Because for sure the monastic authors like Bede, I didn't talk about Bede. Bede knows that churches were built. He doesn't praise them, he allegorizes them. So that's my answer. But it would be interesting to try and figure it out.
Thank you very much. Our next question is from Shachar.
Thank you very much, Professor Deliyannis. You mentioned now also the allegorical perception of these buildings, and I wonder, it's very much thinking with the city of God in mind, to what extent there's a perception that these buildings need to operate, let's say, on two channels maybe at once, on a physical channel symbolizing the power, the authority, and then also on a spiritual level. And to whom is it directed exactly? Like as a, let's say, as a bishop of or even a leader of a community? Do I expect everybody to be able to do these things, or to think in these two channels, or that would be the ideal?
That is a really interesting question, and I've been thinking about that. If you are an educated person, a person educated in exegesis, or you've read your Jerome or something like that, and you know that you're not supposed to be admiring this splendor, but at the same time, there it is. Are you supposed to see it and think every time you go into the church, oh, but this money should all be given to the poor? Clearly, there are people who think that, because some of them write it down. I mean, it keeps going, right? You get it in, I've lost the name, the Cistercian. Oh, well, it's gone out of my head.
Bernard of Clairvaux?
Yes, Bernard. I mean, he says it too, right? Why does Clooney have all that stuff? They should be giving money to the poor. So, but I don't think that at Clooney they have all the stuff to put into people's minds that you should be giving money to the poor. So I think, as you said, it is operating on many planes at once. It's operating on the plane of, we want to have splendid stuff because that's what Romans do. And then, that's what people do. Rich people give lots of money, and the better it looks, the better you are as a patron. That's just a thing. Then you can say, oh, and look, it happened in the Bible as well, so it must be okay. And that's just a straight up thing. And then you get all these theologians saying, no, we have to understand it a different way. And specifically what they're saying is we have to understand the temple in the Bible a different way. Because if that's what Jerome says, right, you can just reject the temple in the Bible, but if you're not going to reject it, then you have to have an explanation for it. And that's why they allegorize it. So anyone who knows that is going to know that. And in the sermons, I really like Zeno Verona's sermon, because there he is, poor man, and they've just built a lovely church. And he gets up and he says, we've just built this lovely church, but let's remember, this is not really what matters. So in those sermons, we can see bishops reminding their congregations that it's not all about the appearance, and yet it is all about the appearance. So that's what I like about it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you. I'm not used to thinking about the material aspect of things just so much, and I think it's a good reminder.
Thank you. Next, we have Professor Rosamund McKitterick.
Hello, Deborah. Thank you for a lovely paper. I'm really contributing to the discussion so far, because as you were speaking, I was reminded both of Mosaic in Ravenna and, of course, in Rome, which I've commented on in my recent book, but it's the bishop holding a model of his church in the church that he's just finished, which, from what you have said, could also be interpreted as an endorsement. This is something that I can do. Here I've done it. It's in my arms and I'm in heaven. I'm mediating between you. And as you know, I've suggested that in a way that little church can be reflecting the congregation. So it actually fits with Zeno's idea that the congregation is the ecclesia. So you've got lots of different dimensions going on at the same time.
That's the beauty of it. And those pictures are reflective of probably similar pictures that involve emperors or kings, possibly. But yes, so the bishop is doing many things in those pictures. I mean, I've interpreted the pictures as representative of the same kind of impulse that I've identified in the Liber Pontificalis, which is that this is what bishops do. They build splendid churches, they give them to God, and this is why they do it. But yes, I love the idea that they are giving the congregation to God. That's, yeah. That's why these things are so interesting, is that they work on so many different levels. The real question is, could you have that? You can have that thought if you're standing in San Vitale in Ravenna and looking at the church. Can you have the same thought if you're standing in Ripon looking at the tomb of Wilfrid with the inscription on it that says, look at all the lovely things he gave to God? And presumably you have the same thought, and you can have the same multiplicity of thoughts as well, which is why it's so interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
Thanks.
Thank you. We still have a few minutes ahead of us, so if anyone wants to ask a question. And in the meantime, I wanted to ask about the notion of patronage, or patronage in relations to church building. So is it restricted to bishops or abbots, or can it be widened to different people? And how does that affect the description of the Temple of Solomon, if it does?
Yeah, that's an interesting question too. So we know from the 4th century, from earlier, that there are inscriptions for synagogues, I believe. I want to say from the 3rd century, that list lots and lots of donors. There are church inscriptions that list lots of people who gave money. There are floor mosaics where it literally says this person donated so many feet of mosaic, and the floor is full of these little donation plaques, as it were. So we know that any church that went up was funded by lots of people. The example of San Vitale in Ravenna is always cited because Agnellis reports an inscription that says that a rich banker named Julian the banker gave a huge sum of gold to build that church. But the bishop is the one who gets the credit. The bishop is the one up in the apse holding the church. That's always a kind of, interesting puzzle. So we definitely know that many people gave funds to a church, that at a certain point, which I would argue in the 6th century, bishops start getting the credit for being, I guess you could say, an impresario of church building in your town. The bishop is the person who gathers all these donations together and directs what's going to be built, in as far as we have records. But the problem is that most of our information comes from biographies of bishops. And so the biographies of bishops naturally all say, oh yeah, it was the bishops. And we don't have the biography of Julianus the banker, which would be nice to have, to know what it said about him. So there's that as well. Whether all those individuals, when in the cases where we have, there are some from France where they list each person and how much money they gave toward the church. Whether they all get to be considered Solomon's, I'm not sure, but maybe.
Just to follow up, if I can.
Yeah.
Sure. Yes, Shahar, go ahead.
Uh-oh. Dreaded Zoom pause.
Let's give her a second or two. There she is. She's back.
Okay. All right. You stalled, but now you're back. Nope.
Oh no, we lost her.
She's gone.
She's gone, but she'll be back. She's striking back. Okay, so till when Shachar comes back. Oh, there she is. There she is.
Apologies.
Shachar?
There you are. Yep.
Just out of curiosity, can we say anything about the difference between how men and women are commemorated who donated funds to the building of churches?
I mean, there are relatively few accounts of women. First of all, women aren't bishops. Bishops are most of the, bishops get a large majority of the texts. There are women mentioned as donors, I want to say in the Liber Pontificalis. I'm trying to, of course, I mean, Galla Placidia in Ravenna. So women who, Gregory of Tours has women who build churches and help to design the churches. So the women are there as well. There are fewer of them, and I haven't counted them, partly because I'm sort of interested in bishops and then everyone else but bishops. I'm trying to think of an example of a female saint who is said to build a church, and I can't think of one.
You think about saints that found churches, or like Balthus, for example, but nothing. Radegund, maybe. Nah.
Got people here who might know. Helena,
Yeah,
okay,
right.
in the
Helena.
chat, Helena, Constantine's mother. Yes.
We have Tracy Schmidt, right? Helena, I didn't see the
Helena, but Galla Placidia and Ravenna built a lot of churches. So,
Right.
you know, the queens and empresses, for sure, they do. I'm just trying to think of female saints, though. And I can't think, I have lists of male saints and hagiographies. Many of them are bishops, of course, who build churches, but I'm not coming up with women. But neither is anyone else. So that makes me feel okay.
There seems to be, you said something about synagogues, and I think in synagogues, from what you said, the commemoration is a lot more in your face, let's put it colloquially.
Today or back?
Yeah, the names in this, as you said earlier, right? This person donated this much mosaic.
Yep.
And this made me think about that, because I wonder also if to what extent there would be a difference between the way donors are commemorated in the building of these community buildings, right? But they also function in divine ways.
Which the builders? Or
no, the buildings themselves, but there's a difference in commemoration of the people who donated the money to make it possible.
Yes. No, I think there is. And I think that part of our problem is that we have so little surviving in the reality, right? So we have the inscriptions that we have surviving are usually of bishops, or they are in Agnellis and other similar collections of poetry. But there are some dedication or dedication inscriptions that do survive. So we know that they were there. And we know the synagogues had them too. I think there are fewer examples of synagogues than there are of churches. So I've looked into it, and I found that there are some where they have lists of donors at the entrance or on the floor or something like that. I think that the donation, it gets very complicated. I mean, there is also the fact, at least in the Christian tradition, that around the 7th century, they start explicitly using the language that donation to a church is done for the good of your soul, which doesn't explicitly show up before that. It's in the life of Wilfrid, I think. One of those passages, or maybe it's Desiderius, says he gave the money for the sake of his soul. And so after a certain point, it becomes explicit that anybody giving money to a church for decoration or anything else is doing it for the sake of their soul, as opposed to making a big splash. But of course, they're doing both, right? But that's the purpose. In the chat, Yanni Fox has said Genevieve of Paris, and yes, and that would be Lisa Bytel's book about building churches in Gaul and Ireland. I forgot about that. So that's an example.
Thank you very much. Has anyone else has a question? Okay, in that case, has anyone, sorry, I've seen someone cancel their mute button. No. All right. So in this case, please join me in thanking Professor Deborah Deliyannis for her wonderful and stimulating talk.
Thank you so much,
Thank you very much.
everyone, for coming.
Our next meeting will take place on May 24th. Professor Albrecht Diem of Syracuse University will speak about the pursuit of early medieval monasticism, new directions of research. We will circulate the flyer. And just before we go, we also wanted to remind the research students in the audience that we have an open call for application for our Textual Communities workshop arranged by the Forum and Utrecht University. The deadline for abstracts is April 23rd, and we welcome any proposals and applications, so feel free. Thank you for joining us today, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you next month. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.